Okay, so Alan, thanks for being with us today. You and I have known each other about a year, and clearly you have an extensive track record of talent acquisition in the US. You're a thought leader on diversity and inclusion, and I'm seeing your content quite frequently on LinkedIn. But perhaps you can just give us a bit of a rundown on how you got to where you are today.
I did start off in recruiting and talent acquisition about 20 years ago, moved my way into leadership roles, which eventually had some vendor management responsibilities. Initially, those vendors that would really easily tie in with talent acquisition and HR, so temporary staffing vendors, background check vendors, applicant tracking system vendors when it came to the point that I was at an employer that was ready for that. And then I took a role with MedImmune, which was a subsidiary of AstraZeneca, now just part of AstraZeneca. They did away with the MedImmune brand. But I took a role there that was in a small HR operations team, and my role, I had one internal direct report, but otherwise I was managing a large team of recruiters through an RPO, and then also managing a master vendor program for temporary staffing, a few other vendors that weren't as closely related to talent acquisition, so relocation, a law firm for immigration, outplacement, which feels like the opposite of talent acquisition, right? You're taking the people out instead of bringing them in. But got into the space to where I became really effective at partnering with procurement and legal and the other parties you wind up working with when you're managing vendors that involve bringing people in and out of your company. And that's where I've spent the last 10 plus years now of my career in talent acquisition roles, but involved with managing the use of search firms, RPO providers, recruitment process outsourcing, and temporary staffing vendors. Progressed into being what I'd call multinational, not global, both at MedImmune and then with AstraZeneca. And then now here in my current role at Danaher, over the last year and a half, it's really become truly global as I've built out a global team supporting our TA vendor management here.
So you've had both, of course, the US market experience, which is the biggest market in the world, but you've also had really upfront, close exposure to other markets in the world and different candidate behaviors. So I'm curious to know what kind of differences you've observed in the behavior of the job seeker, the behavior of the candidate in those different markets.
Yeah, it's really interesting because recruiting globally is not one size fits all, right? So you do have to ask the questions, learn from the locals, I guess I'd say, right? So you can come in having thoughts of how you'd like to do it, but you really have to ask those questions and listen closely. Europe is a different beast. Whereas here in the States we can easily look at LinkedIn as a primary job board, Indeed. There's a couple of places where you can broadcast a job and reach all 50 states, right? And any place else it's a target. And then you move into Europe or APAC and you find out that there's a lot of job boards that support only one country, right? And that's both because of language needs, but also other geographical and maybe non-geographical boundaries. So it becomes a bit different. And it's whereas here in the States, you can feel pretty comfortable. You could probably use Indeed or some of the other job boards, say for blue collar, and you could reach a remote area to staff a factory. You find out once you get outside of the U.S. and start looking at other parts of the world, there's still a heavy dependence on having a local staffing agency, right, that's in the town where the plant is in order to find those blue-collar workers, because you're not going to find them through online means, and they may not talk to you if you're calling from outside of the local geography. So there's definitely nuances, and I wouldn't even say all those I just described. They're necessarily candidate behaviors as much as they're still the common practices within those regions. So I think it's, like I said, it's important to talk to the locals, and whether those locals are from your own company, if you're supporting a global operation, or it's talking to the staffing suppliers, the search firms, the other providers of services in each of those geographies to learn more.
Yeah, great. And of course, life sciences is a very broad industry, talent short because of how fragmented those unique skill sets are, whether it's commercial or scientific or diagnostics or research instrumentation, et cetera. So it's really important that everyone involved in this industry is helping to empower candidates to be their best self in interviews so they can maximize their chance of getting selected for the role. What do you expect your recruitment partners to do in terms of preparing candidates for interviews?
Yeah, it's a good question, Ryan. I think I've probably been in situations where I feel like a recruiter maybe over-prepared somebody, right? So I can think about times in the past where they were coaching candidates to actually rewrite their resume. So, you would get a great-looking resume from the agency, and then you would look in your applicant tracking system and say, well, gee, this person applied to us for a job 4 weeks ago, and it didn't expand upon all these things that this new version of their resume does. But I think whereas the initial response is, oh, the agency is coaching them to add things that they don't have, it's really not that. I mean, if the agency is doing their job, they've gotten to know this individual and they know what they have done, and they're helping them build a better resume, right? And accent the things that will help them match the job they're interested in. And I think that's when you think about it, it's an interesting dynamic because people don't usually have nobody at your company while you're gainfully employed is usually coaching you on how to write a resume or a CV, right? And how to focus and highlight the right things. You don't want to necessarily replicate your entire job description into your resume, but you need to have somebody who helps kind of cull out the things you should be highlighting, right? So I think a good search firm partner is doing that as they screen and interview a candidate and then making those proper suggestions on what should be changed on the resume. So I think I'd say that, over time I've come to appreciate the coaching on the resume as long as they're coaching somebody to actually highlight things that they've truly done. Because otherwise at the interview it'll show that they've not done it when the subject matter expert internally asks them an interview question and hears that they can't answer the thing they should know based on their resume. As long as we're getting factual stuff on there, I think that building a better resume and then really coaching them on how to come in and interview, right? Because I think that's the other thing. People aren't trained on how to interview. They may go out and learn about how to answer behavioral questions or some things online. But I think a good search partner is also helping people, and this will sound weird coming from me because I'm giving you some long-winded answers, but how to answer clear and concise, right, when they're at the interview, and then let that interviewer ask a follow-up question if they truly want more, but otherwise, answer the question that was asked, because often there's a limited amount of time at the interview, and if that interviewer can't ask all the questions they need to, they won't be able to properly score that candidate against other candidates that were able to answer all the questions.
So what does great look like in terms of giving a clear and concise answer?
Well, it depends. Depends on who the interviewer is, right? Because that's the other half, right? We also have to, on the internal side, train our managers on how to be good interviewers as well. And I think it's a tough transition when you think about people who grow up in a manufacturing role. Originally you are an individual contributor, but you may grow into a supervisor or a manager. And suddenly you go from not interviewing people and making hiring selections to doing that. And not every company gives those people all the support they should get when they first become hiring managers. So I think the proper, clear, and concise answer to your question depends on who is over on the other side of the table asking, which I think nowadays we have a wealth of information available, right? Both through, if you're working through a search firm, but also if you go look at that interviewer's LinkedIn profile and then get to know a little more about their background, hopefully get a feeling for what's going to be important to them at the interview. Mm-hmm. But I think the other piece always is trying to stay focused on those aspects of your career, your experience that are relevant to the job. And I think when it does come to behavioral interview questions is trying to practice a couple of answers you would want to use based on the job description you've been presented so that you do have some clear, concise, already in your head answers to share.
Yeah, absolutely. The one I like to coach my candidates on is the STAR method. It's quite widely used. Situation, task, action, result. So when done correctly, that could take 30 to 60 seconds. But as you say, it takes a bit of practice.
Right. And if you practice a few answers that are related to your resume, maybe you don't even have to know what the question's going to be, and you can still use that answer, right? Because if you keep a few of them that are a little bit generic, you'll have a starting answer, and then that's where they can drill deeper if the interviewer chooses to by asking you to go deeper. But I agree with you. Yeah, STAR is one of those, and it's an easy to remember acronym.
Yeah.
So usually if I've been giving anybody coaching, I stick with that as well because it'll resonate with them.
Yeah, and of course, job seekers often are in a little bit of a panic when looking for a new job. Here in Japan, lifetime employment is still very much prevalent. So when someone is looking for a new job, it can be driven by, restructuring and things like that. And so what we find, I don't know how this compares to your experience in the US, but what we find is sometimes candidates need a little bit of reflection on what they actually want to do rather than sort of window shopping for an opportunity and seeing what comes to them, which is why having clear aspirations is so important. How does that compare with your observation in the US in other markets?
Yeah, I mean, I think having I've actually coached some people and told them they needed to go have their vision quest, right? And it sounds a little, I know a little, I'll use a U.S. reference, a little bit Aaron Rodgers, the quarterback, when he supposedly locked himself in a dark room to make his decisions on his career. I don't suggest that we all have to lock ourselves in a dark room, but taking some time to really figure out, and I don't think it really depends on where you're at in your career. You could be entry level or junior, you could be senior, but if you don't step back and figure out what are your career ambitions and your aspirations for your next role, if that's where you're heading to, is looking for a new role, how else will you achieve your career goals, right? If you can't articulate those either for your current boss if you're looking to grow internally, or your potential boss if you're out interviewing for a new role. I do believe, at least from my experience, your aspirations do tend to get clearer once you get more career experience under your belt. So maybe the freshers, the more junior people who only have a few years of work experience, maybe won't have as clearly defined aspirations as you or I might have, Ryan, but I think it's still important to invest the time, right, to consider their aspirations and prepare themselves to speak about those aspirations, right? And like I said, I think that can both be internal career conversations with your boss, with somebody from HR, or then once you're ready to go look at the market for your next role. Because it's also hard to ask so we're talking about search firms and leveraging search firm recruiters. It's hard to ask a search firm recruiter to invest their time to try to market you as a candidate if you can't tell them which jobs you're really going to be happy, right, to hear about. So you do have to have this soul searching time spent so that you can clearly say, this is what I'd like to do in my next role, and here are the things I don't want to do, right? So they don't come back to you, the search firm, with jobs you're not interested in.
Yeah. The what I won't do is just as important as what we want to do for strategy, 100. Right? So you've interviewed hundreds, I'm sure thousands of candidates in your career, and certainly observed as you've managed talent acquisition teams that have been facilitating that as well. If you can think of the most impressive interviews that you've attended, the most impressive candidates that you've interviewed or that you've been in an interview with, what was it about those select few individuals that really made them stand out?
Yeah, so I think there's a few, and I'll probably share two different views. And one is, and this will be from when I was definitely actively recruiting, is seeing certain people that when you looked at their career history, and these are people that have been with the company I was recruiting for at the time for over 10 years, they weren't hasty to make a move every year, right? Because I think the company had a 12-month guideline that you had to stay in your current role at least 12 months before you looked for internal growth. They weren't jumping every 12 months just for a one title jump. They actually stayed put and invested time probably for 2 or 3 years at a role. But then the role they took was a really nice jump, right? So because they'd built so much in that area, they might have went from being a supervisor to a director instead of a supervisor to a manager, or they went from a manager to a director instead of the senior manager step in between. So I think there's something to be said for those people who stay a few cycles and, a few seasons, if you will, in a job, because there's usually a cyclical nature. And these are roles, when I'm thinking of, they were within manufacturing space as well. So I think, for one, because I think it also stands out to hiring managers and to internal recruiters when somebody is just looking for that next step up the ladder and doesn't have the actual aspiration to do the job that they're applying to. So there's that group of people who I saw that really truly made a move only when it was the right next step in their career, and therefore were making some substantial moves. The other ones, it's interesting, it's when I was supporting sales roles, and the level of preparation a salesperson shows up at headquarters to interview for a new role, right? And this was normally going from being, say, a field salesperson to being a district manager. They come in, they have a brag book prepared. Some of them showed up with trophies in their briefcase, right? So they had, if they won the Top Gun award the previous year, they carried it on the airplane and brought it to show me. And I was like, hey, I'm just the HR interview. I want to cover a couple of bases with you. Show that to the hiring manager when you sit with her or him, right? Which the hiring manager probably already knows they won the award, but so they have true measurables, right, to share in sales, whereas a lot of the rest of us have to tell our story during the interview. A salesperson can show you if they've won some awards that they've actually beat out all of their peers. But some of them showed up very well prepared with, and this is, I'm talking 15 years ago now if I think about this, but they showed up with a printed PowerPoint deck to flip through during the interview and basically do a sales presentation for me about why they should get the job. So that may be excessive for most jobs, but the level of preparation that people can do to show up for an interview, I think, is a big deal. If the search firm and the internal recruiters have done their job right, the 2 or 3 or 4 people who are getting interviewed are probably really similar, right? They all have passed a certain bar. They have qualifications at that level or above. So what are those differentiators you can bring, right? And it's that preparedness and how you separate yourself from the other two or three candidates.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing there is, in the first example, someone who's very intentional. They're focused on what they're doing now, but they have an intention, clear aspiration of where they want to go. So when they show up to you, there's nothing to lose because they have something great going on already, and they're engaged and high performing, but they kind of do have that North Star of where they want to go next, and they're open-minded enough to entertain that chance to show up at an interview.
Yep.
And in the
Yep.
second
I'd
case,
say that's a great summary.
And in the second case, what stood out to me was the measurable, not just being prepared, but having that measurable, because that trophy or that number or that award or feedback or something tangible can really speak volumes.
Right. And I think for the rest of us who aren't in sales, that could be sharing a couple of successful projects you've been part of, right? And how you did something, cross-functional, right? Because we have you in there, we know you do this for a living, right? We kind of know what your current job is, but when you can share those other things that may go beyond the boundaries of your normal job. So yeah, I think whatever those things are that can show us a score, a recognition, something where you went above and beyond.
Thank you. That's fantastic insight, Alan. I really appreciate that. The last question two more questions. One is about AI that's just popped to my mind, and that is, with all these AI apps that can create your CV for you and even listen in on an interview and give you scripted responses on the spot, you must have some sort of a word of caution to those folks to, yes, learn about AI, but not let it make you artificial in how you perform.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think, and just as I said, you have to train hiring managers on their initial interview skills. So it may take a little bit of time till our hiring managers and leaders start sniffing out something that sounds too good to be true, right? When those answers are canned. And, I saw an article that was sharing about that there are situations where candidates have AI bots preparing their resume and applying for them. And then, of course, now there's employers who are engaging AI to do the filtering of resumes. So now the whole human element is out of that first introduction, right? And I guess the thing I would caution anybody in the job seeker world that's thinking of that is eventually you may have to go to a face-to-face interview and you won't have AI there prompting you. And then you won't be able to show up. I mean, it's similar to, I know there were stories years ago in the tech space where, it was probably when interviews were getting done this way, but it was pre-pandemic. I remember hearing of this, but it was when the video interviewing became prevalent, and people would interview for an IT job and have all the right answers, but then when they showed up to start working, they couldn't do the work, and it's because they had somebody whispering the answers to them off screen. So they sounded brilliant during the interview, but then they couldn't deliver. And those people, I mean, you're obviously not going to be long for that company, and it's a terrible hit to your reputation. And I've always felt, I've always lived by that under promise and over deliver statement. Mm-hmm. So I would never want to take a job that I faked my way into and thought I would learn it on the fly, right? I mean, that's not fair to your employer. It's not fair to the other candidates who didn't get hired for that role that could have done it.
Yeah.
But I think it's a challenge we're going to have to deal with. And I know the different regulatory bodies in every country are going to start determining where AI can and can't be used in our employment processes. But that's only for us as employers. And I don't think anyone's going to regulate what a job seeker does with AI. But again, I think it's your reputation. And I would never want to be deemed as somebody who cheated to get the job.
Absolutely. So for that busy executive out there, or busy professional, no matter where they are in their career, but they're busy, they're doing well, they're starting to think about what's next. Maybe they're having to change jobs due to reasons outside of their control, or maybe they're just trying to map out their next step to get to where they want to go, but they're busy. What would be your number one advice to those people? Where to start to reflect and prepare themselves?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things that resonate with me. For one, and this is something I coach people who are already in transition, right? So maybe they've been impacted by a layoff, or people who've taken a career break, right? Maybe a woman who took time off to start a family, or it could be a man or a woman who took time off to care for an elder. For one, I think when we get into doing job search, you need to be able to organize what are my target markets, right? What are the industries I'd like to work in? What are the companies I admire I'd like to work for? So that's a little bit of just kind of doing your part of that soul searching we talked about earlier. But then I think it's important to find a couple of people in your network that can be your accountability coaches, right? So not necessarily mentors, because when you think mentor, you think of somebody you're going to take a big learning from, or maybe, it's somebody who's been a former boss. But these could be peers, or it could be a former boss, or it could be your neighbor. But somebody who's going to keep you accountable that you're actually working your plan, right? Once you've created your plan for how you want to look for your next role, some accountability coaches that keep you on task. Because it's very easy, even for the people that are between jobs, to have home matters come up and take you away from a whole day you were planning on doing networking or researching companies, and now instead you're dealing with something else, right? So have some accountability coaches. And I think the other piece is that I think, and it's especially once people reach a certain point in their career, you can only do so much for your next job search on your own. And I think you're going to be needing to leverage, a specialized search firm that supports your particular industry sector you want to work in, or your function, right? If you're an HR person like myself, find a good HR search firm that's going to help open doors to roles that you're not going to find on a job board, or however else you're looking for roles, because there are definitely roles once you're in that mid-career and above that may never hit a job board, never hit a company career site. Even though here in the States, we are supposed to post every job, but there's a lot of recruiting that can be done before that job gets posted, and then it's just posted for the 5 days or whatever the state may require.
Awesome. Thanks, Alan. Is there anything else that you'd like to add with the ambitious professional who may be stagnant in their career and really bursting with potential to step up to that next level?
Yeah, I think, and what brought us together, Ryan, was talking about, your book, right, and how to sell yourself like a CEO. I think when you think about what a CEO does, right, they're clearly the leader of their organization, right? They're making some high level decisions. They're accountable. You could take all those factors, right, and you can be the CEO of me, right? So you need to make those same kind of decisions for yourself, right? So I think it's important taking that, right? Is you could sit back and hope to win the lottery, right? And I'm using the lottery as an example, but that great job is going to come knocking on your door. Or if you're in a rut because you're not happy with the work you're doing at your current employer, you can just hope that things change, right? If you don't like your boss, maybe your boss leaves and goes to another company. You can hope that happens, or you can work on trying to solve that yourself. There's a number of ways you can take to solve that yourself. You can figure out how to approach the matter with your boss, right? Or you can choose to leave your employer and go to work for another employer to escape that boss. But it's really for you to kind of become that CEO of me and set your own strategy, and drive your own plan, right? Like I mentioned earlier. And like I said, I think the accountability too is get those accountability coaches so that you actually are. And it may just be one trusted friend that you share with that friend that, hey, I need to find a new job. And hopefully you pick a friend that'll ask you some questions and challenge you, right? And help you go along that path. But I think there's that. And then there's, like I'll come back to, you can work with a good search firm who's also going to ask you those questions and challenge you and decide whether you're a fit for their type of clients, their industry they support. But we can't do it alone, and the CEO doesn't do it alone either. She or he surrounds themselves with an incredibly strong team. The CEO might come from a finance background, but they're not doing the finance anymore. Once they're in the CEO chair, they get a great controller. They may come from a marketing background. They hire a great marketing person. If you're at a small enough company, maybe you still keep your hands in some of the things that you grew up in. But for the most part, when you become a CEO, you build an incredible team that makes incredible things happen, and you lead that team and you set the strategy for them, right? So go get some people that help you achieve those goals and help hold you accountable to deliver.